What are the best ankle mobility exercises for better squats and Olympic lifts? Now, I kind of apologize here because I think most folks, when they click on a video about the best exercise for ankle dorsiflexion, they're expecting all sorts of fancy stuff, right? Banded ankle dorsiflexion exercises. Maybe we're doing some PNF stretches, all sorts of fancy things. I feel very, very strongly that we should be using the evidence we have that shows, the best guidelines for mobility as opposed to shotgunning a bunch of fancy exercises to improve our patients' mobility, right? So we got to use evidence-based guidelines, and we have to develop a program with sets and reps, right? So when you go to the doctor's office and you have some sort of ailment and they give you a medication, right? They're going to say, hey, I want you to take this medication, but they're also going to give you guidelines for how often to take it, right? They're going to say, I want you to take 2 pills twice a day for 2 weeks or whatever it is, right? So when the physical therapists or coaches say, you need to get more mobile, here's 3 exercises, I want you to do them. How often do you do them? How frequently do you do them, right? Because we have some pretty clear information that if you don't do the stretches for long enough, right? Or if you don't do it frequently enough, you don't make a change. And then we go back to the whole discussion of, I tried a mobility program, it didn't work. Well, it's like, well, did you do the right exercises? Did you do them for long enough? Did you do them with the right frequencies, durations, all that stuff? So I just think it's super important that we know about these. I've written a lot about these parameters. If you want to see some of the evidence over static stretching, I'll put a link that you can click on. All right, a little bit later. So what do I personally recommend to get people more mobile for squats and Olympic lifts? So I usually give people a combination of soft tissue work, right? So this is going to be some sort of foam rolling generally. And what's important to understand is that most of the research on foam rolling for ankle mobility is you make a short-term change, right? I'm not against short-term changes, because if you're going to do soft tissue work, then squat immediately after, you're going to, get the benefits of that short-term improvement, right? And in terms of how frequently you want to be doing this to make a more of a long-term effect, there's been one study that I know of that did some sort of foam rolling for the calf for 3 weeks. They did it 3 times, they did it for 4 weeks, 3 times per week. And they're doing it for 60 seconds to the calf. And they did a test and retest, and they made an improvement in range of motion. So my general recommendation for foam rolling for folks that are trying to improve their ankle flexibility is to foam roll the calves 3 times per week for 60 seconds for at least 4 weeks, and then reassess, right? That being said, I also like to put static stretching, good old ankle stretches. Usually I'll use an ankle stretch against the wall, like this image on the top right here. And the research we have on static stretching is it tends to beat out other forms of stretching, right? It's actually superior to PNF stretching, ballistic stretching, dynamic stretching. There is some research to show it temporarily reduces power, and it doesn't necessarily change the physiology of the muscle, but doesn't mean it's not effective for improving range of motion. It's actually very effective for that, right? So I have my athletes do 60 seconds of static stretching of the soleus 5 times per week, and I do it for 4 weeks. Like I said previously, we have some research to show that if we don't have a high enough frequency, right? So if you just stretch 3 times a week, you might not make a change at all. We need to make sure we have enough frequency within the week. So 5 or more times per week and at least 60 seconds. And just 1 set, because in the same study I'm talking about, so again, I'll throw that link up there. You can click on it. If you did more than 60 seconds, it wasn't more better. You didn't gain more flexibility. So I think you're spinning your wheels if you're doing more than about 60 seconds at a time. The next piece is that you have to do it for at least 4 weeks to make a change. Going back to the example of someone who didn't make progress, if you do stretches for 2 weeks, right, and you didn't progress, then it doesn't mean that the stretching didn't work. If you talk to a lot of elite gymnasts, in order to improve their mobility, it took years and years to do that, okay? So it just takes a lot of dedication to build the mobility where you want, right? The other intervention I use a ton for ankle flexibility are going to be eccentrics. So an eccentric contraction is going to be the muscle firing while the muscle is lengthening. So think about doing a calf raise. When you get to the top of the calf raise and we're descending back to the bottom position, right? So we're getting that stretch in the bottom position of a calf raise. That's an eccentric contraction, all right? We have a lot of research on these showing that they're effective, right, for improving mobility, but also about effective as static stretching, which is wonderful, right? The other thing that's very cool about eccentrics is that we don't have to do them as frequently as static stretching in order to make, to make progress in flexibility. So the research on eccentrics in terms of the sets and reps that are most optimal for range of motion, it's all over the place, right? But suffice to say, if you're doing it for about 2 to 3 times per week, somewhere between 1 and 3 sets, somewhere between 6 and 8 repetitions, we do this for 4 weeks, we're probably going to make a change. So what's my favorite exercise from an eccentric perspective for ankle mobility? I love single-legged calf raises, where on the way up, you can use your other leg to help out, and then a very slow eccentric lower to the very bottom position of the calf raise with a stretch. Okay. So maybe that's 3 to 5 seconds on the lowering phase with a 2 to 3 second pause at the bottom, come right back up to the start position and do 6 to 8 repetitions of that. Okay. So that's it. Soft tissue work followed by static stretching, followed by eccentrics, doing that for about 4 weeks. And then you reassess your range of motion. The other thing that's probably, and I shouldn't say probably because I think it's really important, is to make sure you're utilizing this new flexibility when you're squatting in the future. All right. So my recommendation for folks after they do their mobility program is that they should probably squat afterward or Olympic lift afterward and spend some time in the very bottom position of the squat and try to actively utilize all of the range of motion you just created in the ankle. And the other thing to think about is that if you just created new range of motion in the ankle and you're loading up a heavy squat, chances are you're not going to use that new range of motion just because you are practiced in a position that doesn't have that same ankle range of motion, and you are strong in a position that doesn't utilize that new range of motion just because you've never trained that new position. So you may find you have to knock a little bit of weight off the bar, and when you go down to the squat, you have to constantly remind yourself to use that new ankle range of motion, and when you come out of the hole, not to just shoot your hips straight up and back into the same position it used to use for years and years. So if you are loving what you are learning right now, I highly recommend you check out my Fitness Pain-Free episode where we go over a patellar and quadriceps tendinopathy guide. I will leave a link in the show notes. Definitely recommend checking it out. You can also click on the link right above if you're watching this on YouTube and get started watching right away.